I wanted to share some thoughts that I've been having about the balance of this decade, and I want to put it in the context of the century as a whole, because I think a lot about broad sweeps in history and economics and society. This is not from the point of view of a trained economist or academic or scholar. This is just from someone who thinks and reads about these kinds of topics a lot, and really just have a few general points to make about what I see as the most likely path ahead. And this is all very United States centric, because that's my background and really where my perception is anchored. So this is brief and I hope easy to understand, but let's just walk through these thoughts. And I start with a few assumptions. One is that any given population unites best around a common foe. And of course, through my own childhood, that was the Soviet Union, the Red Menace. And that has changed for obvious reasons. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Another assumption is that in spite of pretending that they're the ones driving the bus, the politicians and the central bankers are really more observers than instigators in what goes on around us. I've always thought it's sort of a pity that, for example, the president gets credit for good things going on or gets blamed for bad things going on. It's really not deserved in either case. Central bankers and senior leadership obviously have some influence as to policy and decisions, but I think that, for example, assuming Bill Clinton somehow created the prosperity of the late 1990s or had anything to do with it at all, or blaming, for example, George Bush the First for the recession in 1991 is really wrong-headed. So I do think these cycles are gargantuan and really beyond human reach. Another assumption is that, generally speaking, you should really never underestimate just how uninformed most people are, and they really have not seen or grasped true large economic cycles. And for a lot of people, especially those born after, let's say, 1980, they've really never witnessed a bear market or even an economic downturn. So this is all like science fiction to them, I would suppose. And finally, and probably the biggest point of all, is that the aid, if you want to call it that, from the Federal Reserve and the government in general, from 1987 forward, and particularly from 2009 to present, isn't free. And I think we're already seeing the repercussions of that in terms of an incredible debt, raging inflation, economic malaise. And I think this is really just the beginning of the day of reckoning for those countless tens of trillions that have been dumped onto the population in the name of prosperity. So moving on, let's talk about quickly 100 years from 1930 to 2029 inclusive. So I've broken this into just a handful of broad eras. The first one is the 30s, which was dominated by the Great Depression and also the tremendous growth of federal government, because before the 1930s, the federal government, for most people, was just an afterthought. It was almost meaningless. And FDR really commenced the age of big government. And that was a real shapeshifter for the country after the 30s. Of course, there was World War II, in which the U.S. had the incredible advantage of two giant oceans on either side of it, which allowed it to play the world's hero and also become kind of the last man standing in terms of the only great industrialized country left. And that really laid the groundwork for decades of growth and prosperity. And on the whole, peace. If you set aside the Korea and Vietnam, on the whole, it was really a lot of glorious decades for the U.S. And that really culminated in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I would say the tippity top of United States prestige, influence, power, wealth was pretty much the turn of the millennium. And it obviously makes a very easy thumbtack to put 9/11 as the turning point for that. And that's very, very close to what I would think of as the long decline. And that decline has tried to appear in fits and starts. We, of course, had the bear market of 2000 to 2002. We had the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. And as I'm recording this, we're having a semblance of a bear market now, where we've had about $30 trillion of global wealth erased from the bond and the stock markets. And my supposition is that these are really just the precursors for the biggie, which is yet to come. And when it terminates and how it terminates, obviously is beyond any of our capacity. But my hope is that we'll come out on the other side of this intact and, wiser and ready to start something better and cleaner after the excesses are completely wrung out of the system. So let's turn our attention to what I said earlier about how a common enemy. Now, when I was growing up, it was pretty clear that the U.S., on the whole, was fairly unified. Of course, in the likes of World War II, that's when the country feels very, very close and very united. And, in the 70s and in the 80s, I'm sure people would point to political divisions and so forth, but it was nothing compared to what we have these days. So on the whole, having a bad guy who's someone besides us made it very clear and simple to stand together as a people. That has changed completely after the fall of the Soviet Union, because humans just seem to have this need to hate somebody else. And so we've turned against each other. And it takes all kinds of forms. We simplistically talk about blue states and red states. If you took a time machine back to, 1986 and used these terms, they would have no idea what you're talking about. They would probably assume you're talking about a Dr. Seuss book or something. But this is the common lingo today. You've got easy characterizations of just bleeding the rich dry, as opposed to, no, these are our heroes, these are job creators, leave them alone, tax them as little as possible, there should be no wealth tax, etc. No death tax, as they call it. You've got the idea on the one hand of social services, safety nets everywhere, basically make it impossible for anybody to fail. Where on the other side, it's like, well, you're kind of on your own, pal. And of course, the whole idea of the social justice warriors and equality for everybody and identity politics, etc., versus just like get out of my face and I won't bug you either. And these are simplistic, I realize, but I do think that it makes for pretty crisp way to see these divisions and how the extremes are faced off against one another. Now, what I find quite interesting is the elections that are forthcoming. And we already started to see things to kind of unravel in recent years. The backlash against George Bush II, as well as the great financial crisis, led to the first black president in history, and relatively left-leaning one. Not people considered him like this radical socialist. He was just a little left of center, actually, at most. And then, as a pendulum against that, after 8 years of Obama, it's like, well, let's go to somebody who could not be any different, more different. Let's go to Trump, who lasted one term. And then, of course, we got our current president. And my view, and as I'm recording this, it's just really just days away from the midterm elections of 2022. And at the moment, we have terrible inflation. We've got a president who is seen as very kind of out of touch and feeble. And this video may age badly if I'm wrong, but my hunch is that the GOP will take back almost certainly the House and maybe even the Senate. And so if they take them both back, we're just going to create 2 years of complete stalemate. But it gets really interesting in the next presidential election, because my view is that if the GOP does take back Congress and like, by God, we're going to fix everything, well, they're not going to fix anything. And then the public will be like, well, now what? And I think that opens the door for either an extreme left or an extreme right candidate. Because I really have trouble believing that the economy will just be hunky-dory for 2023 and 2024. I think that it'll get really bad, which sets the scene for someone incomprehensible. And then, of course, finally, depending on how things go, if the wheels completely fall off the country, God only knows what the 2028 election looks like. So this is sort of like, will the U.S. even survive or not kind of questions. Now, having talked a bit about politics, just want to look toward the implications of how soft and squishy, especially the younger generation is with respect to jobs and the economy. And metaphorically speaking, I think you could think of the economy or business growth like a garden or a landscape, which is basically fed and watered by easy financial conditions. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because in my view, if you look at like some of the worst times in U.S. economic history, like the mid-'70s, you get companies like Apple and Microsoft that are created. And the reason that they were born and survived and grew into these multi-trillion-dollar powerhouses, almost half a century later, is because they were created at a time of real competition, and it's tough to get money, it's tough to raise money, and indeed both companies were bankrolled by very, very little cash. Apple famously, not even $2,000 started that company when they sold their VW bus and a calculator. So my view is that the tough times create the great companies, whereas during times like the past few years, when there's unlimited money for any idea at all, you get complete junk companies and frauds like Nikola, like Theranos and WeWork and Sophie, et cetera, that won't survive. I mean, they're already sort of blinking off the radar. And I really don't think, I think the bankruptcy courts are going to be very busy in the coming years. And as with companies, I see this with people too. And we've all heard this famous quartet of phrases. And I think we're sort of in the weak men create hard times phase of our cycle as a world and as a nation. So just to wrap things up, I see certain driving factors creating certain results in the next few years. There is massive wealth inequality right now. And I think that as the middle class continue to disappear and the poor get poorer, they're going to get really pissed off. And the populist politicians will try their best to go after where the money is. It's like the famous, what was it, Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. Well, same thing, politicians, why do you tax the rich? Well, that's where the money is. Doesn't do any good to crank up taxes on the poor. They don't got no money. So go after the billionaires. I think worldwide, there'll be growing strife as various countries struggle with these same economic problems. And some populations will want to basically just let's solve our own problems, let's be isolated. Politicians in some instances will want to go to war because that's always a good distraction from domestic problems. In the US, the budget and the deficit, I think, will just get worse and worse, which again, I think will be more taxes for everybody. And the IRS will become ever more powerful as they really are put in the role of a confiscatory body of assets and of income, because they've got this giant hole they have to fill. And while all this is going on, the poorest, the bottom 20%, are just going to get more and more poor and turning to crime more and more. And I think that you're going to have a disintegration of society, and people who have the means to do so are going to get the hell out of troubled areas and get as far away from the crime as they can, which will just, of course, make those blighted areas even worse. I mean, like the mid-70s in New York City all over again. And protection and safety are going to be more cherished than ever, and increasingly a luxury of the upper class. And lastly, the government, I think, will try to intrude deeper and deeper into our own lives, like in the form of central bank digital currencies, surveillance, etc. And I think that while that's going on, you're going to see just more anger from the population, and again, kind of a populist backlash against that kind of intrusion. But it's really, to me, it's really all leading to 2028 as the linchpin as to whether we get out of this okay or not. I say again, I certainly hope we do, for everybody's sake. But these are perilous times, and if nothing else, I would say keep your eyes wide open and learn as much as you can and be prepared.